The old bus wheezed to a stop in front of the weathered wooden sign that read, Willow Creek, Texas, population 847. A cloud of dust swirled around the vehicle as it settled with a final mechanical sigh. The door opened with a rusty creak and Maria Santos stepped down onto the dirt road. Her boots hit the ground with quiet determination as she adjusted the worn leather strap of her small travel bag across her shoulder. The morning sun was already fierce even, though it was barely past 8 in the morning. The heat shimmered off the dusty main street where a few early risers were beginning their daily routines. Maria looked around at the small town that would either become her new home or another place that would reject her dreams. She had traveled over 300 miles from the small farm where she grew up with her grandfather in Mexico to reach this remote corner of Texas. Maria was 20, 3 years old with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid and brown eyes that held both gentleness and steel. She wore practical clothes that had seen many days of hard work. Her boots were scuffed but well-maintained, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who was no stranger to physical labor. Everything about her appearance suggested a woman who was serious about work and not interested in playing games or seeking easy paths. As she walked down the main street, several people stopped their conversations to stare at her. Women whispered behind their hands while men tipped their hats politely but kept their distance. Strangers were rare in Willow Creek, and a young woman traveling alone was almost unheard of. Maria ignored the stares and focused on finding the Henderson Ranch, which she had heard was the largest cattle operation in the area. The general store owner pointed her toward the edge of town where a dirt road led to the ranch headquarters. Maria thanked him and began the 2-mile walk under the increasingly hot Texas sun. With each step she thought about her grandfather who had taught her everything she knew about horses, cattle, and, most importantly, how to handle a rifle with deadly accuracy. Her grandfather, Ramon, had been a different kind of man than most. While other girls her age were learning to cook and sew, he had taken Maria out to the fields and taught her to shoot tin cans off fence posts. By the time she was 12, she could hit a target the size of a silver dollar from 50 yards away. By 15, she was better with a rifle than any man in their small village. Her grandfather always told her that a person who could not protect what mattered to them did not deserve to keep it. The Henderson Ranch spread out before her like a small kingdom of cattle and horses. Wooden fences stretched in every direction, and she could see cowboys working with horses in distant corrals. The main house was a large, sturdy building with a wide porch that provided shade from the relentless sun. Several smaller buildings, including a bunkhouse and what appeared to be an office, were scattered around the main compound. Maria walked up to the office building where she could hear men talking inside. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and knocked on the wooden door. The conversation inside stopped immediately and heavy footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal a tall, weathered man in his 50s with gray hair and skin like leather from decades in the sun. Buck Williams had been the foreman of Henderson Ranch for over 20 years. He had seen every kind of person imaginable come looking for work, but he had never seen anyone quite like the young woman standing in front of his office. His first thought was that she must be lost or looking for someone who worked at the ranch. "Good morning, Mom," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of politeness that was automatic for men of his generation. "What can I do for you today?" Maria looked him directly in the eyes, which was something that surprised Buck immediately. Most people, especially women, tended to look down or away when speaking to him. There was something in her steady gaze that suggested she was not easily intimidated or impressed. "I am looking for work," she said simply. "I heard you might need ranch hands." Buck nearly dropped his hat. Behind him in the office, he could hear the other men stopping their conversation to listen. The idea of a woman asking for ranch handwork was so unusual that it took him a moment to process what she had said. "Mom, I think there might be some misunderstanding," he said slowly. "We are looking for ranch hands, but that means riding horses all day in dangerous country, dealing with wild cattle, and sometimes facing down rustlers who shoot first and ask questions later. This is not work for a lady." The other men had quietly moved to the doorway to see what was happening. There were 5 of them, ranging in age from early 20s to past 50. All of them were tough, experienced cowboys who had spent their lives doing dangerous work in harsh conditions. They looked at Maria with expressions that ranged from amusement to outright skepticism. Maria did not back down or show any sign of being intimidated by their stares. She had expected this reaction and had prepared herself for it during the long bus ride to Willow Creek. "I can do the work," she said firmly. "I have been working with cattle and horses since I was a child. I'm not afraid of hard work or dangerous situations. I'm asking for a chance to prove what I can do." One of the younger cowboys laughed out loud. Joe Martinez was 25 years old and considered himself quite the expert on what women could and could not do. He had never met a woman who could even saddle a horse properly, much less handle the dangerous work of a real ranch hand. "Lady, you do not understand what we do out here," he said with a grin. "This is not like feeding chickens or milking cows. We ride hard through rough country, chasing down wild steers that can kill a man with their horns. We camp out in the desert for weeks at a time. We face down armed rustlers who would shoot us without thinking twice about it." Buck held up his hand to quiet Joe, but the damage was already done. The other men were nodding in agreement, and Maria could see the dismissal in their faces. They had already decided that she was just another woman who did not understand the reality of ranch work, but something in Maria's expression made Buck hesitate before sending her away. He had been hiring ranch hands for many years, and he had developed an instinct for reading people. Most of the women who occasionally showed up at the ranch were either looking for husbands or had unrealistic ideas about what ranch life was like. This woman was different somehow. The ranch was also in desperate need of help. Rustlers had been hitting ranches all across the county, and good, reliable workers were becoming harder and harder to find. The Henderson Ranch had lost several head of cattle in recent weeks, and Old Man Henderson was pressuring Buck to find more men who could help protect the herd. "I tell you what," Buck said after a long pause. "We do need help around here, but not the kind of help you are probably thinking of. We could use someone to cook meals and keep the bunkhouse clean. The pay is not as much as a regular ranch hand makes, but it includes room and board. Would that kind of work interest you?" Maria felt disappointment wash over her, but she did not let it show on her face. She had hoped to be given a chance to prove herself as a real ranch hand, but she also knew that sometimes a person had to start wherever they could and work their way up to where they wanted to be. "I will take the job," she said simply. "When do I start?" Buck smiled for the first time since she had arrived. "Well, I guess you can start right now if you want to. Let me show you where you will be staying and introduce you to the rest of the crew." As they walked toward the bunkhouse, the other men followed behind them, talking quietly among themselves. Maria could hear fragments of their conversation, and it was clear that they found the whole situation amusing. They were already making jokes about having a woman around to take care of them. Maria ignored their comments and focused on learning everything she could about the layout of the ranch and the routines of the men who worked there. She would show them what she was capable of, but she would do it on her own terms and in her own time. Her grandfather had taught her that patience was often more powerful than immediate action. The bunkhouse was a long, low building with simple but clean accommodations. Buck showed her to a small private room at one end that had apparently been used for storage. It contained a narrow bed, a small table, and a wooden chair. It was not luxurious, but it was clean and private, which was more than Maria had expected. "You can get settled in, and then I will show you the kitchen and explain what we need you to do," Buck said. "The men eat breakfast at sunrise, dinner at noon, and supper at sunset. They work hard and they eat a lot, so you will be kept busy." Maria nodded and set her small bag on the bed. She looked around the simple room that would be her home for the foreseeable future, and felt a mixture of disappointment and determination. This was not the job she had come here hoping to get, but it was a beginning. She would prove herself worthy of better things through hard work and patience. Outside, she could hear the men still talking and laughing about the situation. She knew they saw her as nothing more than a cook and housekeeper who would make their lives a little easier. They had no idea that she could outshoot any of them, or that she had been handling difficult situations since she was a child. But they would learn soon enough. Maria Santos had not traveled 300 miles to spend her life in a kitchen. She had come to Texas to become a real ranch hand, and that is exactly what she intended to do, no matter how long it took. The first week at Henderson Ranch passed like a slow-moving river for Maria Santos. She woke before dawn each morning to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands who would ride out to check cattle and mend fences. The kitchen became her domain, but it felt more like a prison than a workplace. Every morning she watched through the window as the men saddled their horses and rode out to do the real work of the ranch while she remained behind to wash dishes and sweep floors. Buck Williams had been clear about her duties. Cook 3 meals a day, keep the bunkhouse clean, and stay out of the way of the real ranch work. The men treated her politely enough, but she could see in their eyes that they considered her just another piece of equipment like the stove or the water pump. Something useful but not really important to the serious business of running cattle. Joe Martinez was the worst of them when it came to making jokes about having a woman around. Every morning at breakfast he would make comments about how nice it was to have someone to take care of them, like their mothers used to do. The other men would laugh and Maria would continue serving their food without showing any reaction. But inside she burned with frustration at being reduced to nothing more than a servant. The only person who treated her with genuine respect was an older cowboy named Pete Harrison. Pete was nearly 60 years old and had been working ranches since he was 14. He had seen enough of life to know that people often surprised you if you gave them a chance. While the other men ignored Maria, except when they needed something, Pete would sometimes stay after meals to talk with her about ranch work and life in general. Pete could see that Maria knew more about cattle and horses than she let on. When he mentioned problems they were having with a particular bull that kept breaking through fences, Maria would ask intelligent questions that showed she understood animal behavior. When he talked about the best grass for winter feeding, she would nod knowingly and sometimes offer suggestions based on what her grandfather had taught her. One evening after the other men had gone to their bunks, Pete lingered in the kitchen while Maria cleaned the last of the dinner dishes. The old cowboy sat at the wooden table rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers while he watched her work. "You know more about ranch work than you let on," he said quietly. "Where did you learn so much about cattle?" Maria paused in her dishwashing and looked at Pete carefully. She had been waiting for someone to notice that she was not just an ordinary woman looking for easy work. Pete seemed like the kind of man who could be trusted with the truth. "My grandfather raised cattle on a small ranch in Mexico," she said. "I worked with him from the time I could walk until I was old enough to come north looking for better opportunities. He taught me everything he knew about animals and land and how to survive in hard country." Pete nodded slowly. "I figured it was something like that. You ask the right questions and you understand things that most people would not know. Why did you not tell Buck about your experience when you asked for work?" Maria dried her hands on a cloth towel and sat down across from Pete at the table. "Because men like Buck do not believe that a woman can do the same work as a man no matter what experience she has. I thought it would be better to show them what I could do rather than try to convince them with words." "You might be right about that," Pete said. "But you are not going to get much chance to show them anything if you spend all your time in this kitchen. The real work happens out there with the cattle and horses." Maria looked out the window toward the corrals where she could see horses moving in the moonlight. She had been thinking the same thing for days, but had not seen any way to change her situation without causing problems that might get her fired. Every evening after supper, the ranch hands would spend time behind the barn practicing with their guns. They would set up tin cans and bottles on fence posts and take turns trying to hit them. Maria could hear the shots from the kitchen and it made her fingers itch to hold a rifle again. She had not fired a gun since leaving her grandfather's ranch, and she missed the familiar weight of a weapon in her hands. The men treated their shooting practice like a game. They would make bets on who could hit the most targets and laugh when someone missed an easy shot. From what Maria could hear through the open window, most of them were decent shots but nothing special. Her grandfather would have called them adequate for basic ranch work, but not skilled enough to handle real trouble. One evening, Maria finished her kitchen duties earlier than usual and decided to take a walk around the ranch buildings. The evening air was cooler than the brutal heat of the day, and she needed to escape the confines of the kitchen for a few minutes. As she walked past the barn, she could hear the familiar sound of gunshots from the practice area behind the building. Curiosity got the better of her, and she quietly made her way to where she could observe the men without being seen. They had set up a row of tin cans on fence posts about 30 yards away and were taking turns trying to knock them down. Joe Martinez was bragging about his shooting ability, while the others watched and offered comments. Maria watched for several minutes as each man took his turn. They were using standard ranch rifles, and most of their shots were hitting close to the targets, but not always dead center. A few cans fell, but many shots went wide or hit the fence posts instead of the intended targets. These men would be able to handle basic ranch problems, but they would struggle against experienced rustlers or other serious threats. Buck Williams stepped up to take his turn, and Maria could see that he was a better shot than the younger men. His first shot knocked down a can cleanly, and his second shot did the same. But his third shot missed completely, and the men laughed good-naturedly at their foreman's failure. "I reckon that is enough practice for tonight," Buck said. "We have cattle to move tomorrow, and everyone needs to get some rest." As the men began to head back toward the bunkhouse, Maria noticed that they left their rifles and ammunition behind. This was not unusual since the practice area was considered safe and secure within the ranch boundaries, but it gave Maria an idea that made her heart beat faster with excitement. She waited until all the men had disappeared into the bunkhouse and the lights had been turned out. Then she quietly made her way to where the rifles had been left. She picked up one of the weapons and felt the familiar comfort of good steel and wood in her hands. The rifle was clean and well-maintained, which showed that the men took proper care of their equipment, even if their shooting skills could use improvement. Maria looked at the row of tin cans that remained on the fence posts. In the moonlight, she could barely make them out, but her grandfather had taught her to shoot in all kinds of light conditions. She had spent countless hours as a child learning to hit targets by moonlight, starlight, and even in complete darkness, using only sound and instinct to guide her shots. She raised the rifle to her shoulder and felt her body automatically assume the proper shooting stance that her grandfather had drilled into her thousands of times. Her breathing slowed and her heartbeat steadied as she focused on the barely visible target. The night sounds of the ranch faded away until all she could hear was her own quiet breathing. The first shot rang out clear and sharp in the night air. The leftmost tin can disappeared from the fence post with a satisfying metallic clang. Maria worked the bolt action smoothly and acquired her second target. Another shot and another can vanished into the darkness. She continued down the line until all 6 remaining cans had been eliminated with 6 perfect shots. Maria lowered the rifle and smiled for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Her grandfather's training had not abandoned her despite the weeks of kitchen work and domestic duties. She was still the marksman he had trained her to be, and that knowledge filled her with confidence and determination. She carefully cleaned the rifle and returned it to exactly the position where she had found it. Then she made her way quietly back to her room in the bunkhouse. Tomorrow the men would find the missing cans and wonder what had happened to them. They might assume that animals had knocked them down or that the wind had blown them away. But Maria knew that sooner or later an opportunity would come for her to show them what she was really capable of. When that moment arrived, she would be ready to prove that Buck Williams had made a serious mistake in judging her abilities, based on her gender rather than her skills. As she lay in her narrow bed listening to the night sounds of the ranch, Maria thought about her grandfather and the lessons he had taught her about patience and timing. He had always said that the best hunters knew when to wait and when to strike. Her time for striking had not yet come, but she could feel it approaching like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The third Tuesday of Maria's time at Henderson Ranch started like any other morning. She woke before dawn and began preparing breakfast for the men who would soon be riding out to check the cattle in the north pasture. The coffee was brewing and bacon was sizzling in the large iron skillet when she heard unusual sounds coming from outside. Horses were moving faster than normal and men were shouting to each other with an urgency that made Maria stop her cooking to listen more. Carefully, Buck Williams burst through the kitchen door with his hat in his hand and worry written across his weathered face. His boots were still dusty from a hard ride, and his shirt showed the sweat stains of someone who had been pushing his horse to its limits. "Maria, we got trouble," he said quickly. "Rustlers hit the north pasture sometime before dawn. They cut out a dozen head of our best breeding stock and are driving them toward the river. I need every man who can ride and shoot to come with me right now." Maria felt her heart begin to beat faster. This was the kind of situation her grandfather had prepared her for during all those years of training. She had been waiting for weeks to prove what she could do, and now the opportunity was presenting itself in the most direct way possible. "How many rustlers?" she asked, as she turned off the stove and moved away from the breakfast preparations. Buck looked at her with surprise. He had not expected her to ask tactical questions about a dangerous situation that was clearly men's work. 3 men on horseback from what I could see of their tracks. They got about a 2-hour head start on us, but we might be able to catch them before they reach the river crossing. The other ranch hands were already gathering their weapons and saddling their horses. Maria could see them through the window, moving with the efficient speed of men who had dealt with rustlers before. Joe Martinez was checking his rifle, while Pete Harrison was tightening the cinch on his saddle. Every man on the ranch except for old Pete would be needed for this chase. "Wait," Buck said suddenly as he realized the problem with his plan. Pete cannot ride hard with his bad leg. Someone needs to stay here to watch the main house and the rest of the cattle. Pete, you will have to remain behind while the rest of us go after those rustlers. Pete nodded grimly, but Maria could see the frustration in his eyes. The old cowboy hated being left behind during times of trouble, but his injured leg from an old riding accident made it impossible for him to keep up during a hard chase across rough country. Maria made her decision in that instant. "I'm coming with you," she said to Buck in a voice that left no room for argument. Buck stared at her as if she had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. The other men who were within hearing distance stopped what they were doing to look at her with expressions of complete disbelief. "Maria, that is not possible," Buck said slowly. "This is dangerous work, and these rustlers will not hesitate to shoot anyone who gets in their way. You need to stay here where it is safe and let the men handle this situation." Maria was already moving toward the door. She had made up her mind, and nothing Buck could say would change it. "I can ride and I can shoot," she said firmly. "You need every person you can get if you want to catch those rustlers before they escape with your cattle." Joe Martinez laughed out loud at what he considered a ridiculous suggestion. "Lady, you do not understand what we are talking about," he said. "We are going to be riding hard across dangerous country chasing armed men who make their living by stealing and killing. This is not a game or a Sunday ride to church." But Pete Harrison stepped forward with a thoughtful expression on his lined face. He had been watching Maria carefully for the past few weeks and had seen things that the other men had missed. "Maybe we should listen to what she has to say," he suggested. "She knows more about ranch work than any of us realized." Buck shook his head decisively. "I am not taking a woman into a gunfight no matter what she thinks she knows about cattle or horses. Maria, you stay here with Pete and keep watch on things while we are gone. We should be back before nightfall." Maria felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Her grandfather had taught her that losing your temper was a luxury that could get you killed in dangerous situations. Instead of arguing further, she simply walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Buck demanded. "To saddle my horse," she replied without turning around. Buck followed her, outside with the other men trailing behind. The morning sun was already hot and promised another scorching day. Maria walked directly to the corral where her horse was waiting and began preparing for what she knew would be the most important ride of her life. The ranch hands watched in amazement as Maria expertly saddled her horse and checked her equipment with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done these tasks thousands of times before. Her movements were confident and economical without any wasted motion or uncertainty. "Maria, you are not coming with us, and that is final," Buck said in his most authoritative voice. "This is too dangerous, and I will not be responsible for getting you hurt or killed." Maria swung into her saddle and looked down at Buck with steady eyes. "Then I will follow you anyway," she said simply. "You cannot stop me from riding on open range, and you cannot prevent me from helping if I choose to do so. It would be better if we worked together rather than having me trailing behind where I might cause problems." Buck realized that he was facing a situation he had never encountered before. Maria Santos was not acting like any woman he had ever known. There was something in her manner that suggested she was completely serious about her intentions and fully prepared to back up her words with actions. The sound of distant gunshots carried across the morning air and reminded everyone that time was running out. The rustlers were getting further away with each passing moment, and every minute of delay made it less likely that the stolen cattle could be recovered. Joe Martinez spat in the dust and shook his head in disgust. "Fine," he said. "Let her come if she wants to get herself killed. Maybe that will teach her about trying to do man's work." Pete walked over to Maria's horse and looked up at her with concern in his old eyes. "You be careful out there," he said quietly. "These are not good men we are chasing, and they will not show mercy to anyone who tries to stop them." Maria nodded to the old cowboy who had shown her kindness during her time at the ranch. "I will be careful, Pete," she promised. "But those cattle belong to this ranch, and I intend to help get them back where they belong." Buck mounted his horse with visible reluctance. Against his better judgment, he was about to lead a woman into what could easily become a deadly confrontation with armed criminals. Everything in his experience told him this was a mistake, but Maria Santos had left him with no good options. "Stay behind us and do exactly what I tell you," Buck ordered. "If shooting starts, you get behind cover and stay there until it is over. Do you understand me?" Maria understood perfectly, but she had no intention of hiding behind rocks while others fought battles she was better equipped to win. Instead, she simply nodded and followed as Buck led the small group of riders out of the ranch compound and across the open range toward where the rustlers had last been seen. The chase was about to begin, and Maria Santos finally had her chance to show the men of Henderson Ranch exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. Her grandfather had prepared her for this moment through years of training, and now it was time to put those lessons to the test in the most dangerous way possible. As they rode hard across the rough Texas landscape, Maria felt the familiar excitement of the hunt flowing through her veins. She had been patient long enough, and now the time for action had finally arrived. Before this day was over, Buck Williams and his men would learn that they had been living and working alongside someone whose skills far exceeded anything they had imagined possible. The stolen cattle were out there somewhere waiting to be rescued, and the rustlers who had taken them were about to discover that they had picked the wrong ranch to rob. Maria Santos was riding to her destiny, and nothing was going to prevent her from proving herself when the moment of truth finally arrived. The riders pushed their horses hard across the broken Texas landscape, following the clear trail left by the rustlers and stolen cattle. Buck Williams rode in the lead with his weathered face set in grim determination, while Maria Santos kept pace beside him despite his earlier orders for her to stay behind. The morning sun climbed higher, and the heat grew more intense with each passing mile, but nobody complained or suggested slowing down. Joe Martinez rode slightly behind the others, constantly looking back at Maria with expressions that mixed skepticism with outright hostility. He still believed that bringing a woman along on this dangerous mission was a mistake that would get someone killed before the day was over. Every few minutes he would make comments under his breath about crazy women who did not know their place in the world. The trail led through increasingly rough country with deep ravines and rocky outcroppings that provided perfect places for ambushes. Buck had been tracking rustlers for more than 20 years, and he knew that experienced thieves would choose their escape routes carefully to give themselves every possible advantage against pursuit. After 2 hours of hard riding, they finally spotted their quarry in the distance. The three rustlers were driving the stolen cattle along a dry riverbed toward a crossing point that would take them into the next county, where local law enforcement would have no jurisdiction. Buck called a halt and gathered his men behind a cluster of large boulders to plan their approach. From their position, they could see that the rustlers had chosen their defensive position well. They were on higher ground with clear sight lines in all directions and plenty of rocks to provide cover if shooting started. The stolen cattle were bunched together in a natural corral, formed by steep banks on three sides, with the only exit being the path the rustlers intended to use for their escape. Buck studied the situation carefully with the experienced eye of someone who had been in similar confrontations many times before. The rustlers clearly knew what they were doing and had positioned themselves where they could control the entire battlefield. Any direct approach would leave the ranch hands exposed to enemy fire across open ground, with very little cover available. "We are going to have to be smart about this," Buck said quietly. "There are 3 of them and 4 of us, but they have the advantage of position, and they probably have more experience in gunfights than most of us do. If we make a mistake, someone is going to end up dead." Joe Martinez checked his rifle and peered around the edge of their rocky shelter toward the rustlers' position. "What do you want to do, boss?" he asked. "We cannot just sit here and let them get away with our cattle." Buck was considering their limited options when one of the rustlers apparently spotted movement among the rocks where the ranch hands were hiding. The man raised his rifle and fired a shot that struck the boulder near Buck's head, sending rock fragments flying in all directions. "Get down!" Buck shouted as more shots began coming from the rustlers' position. The ranch hands pressed themselves against the rocks while bullets whined overhead and kicked up dust all around their hiding place. They were effectively pinned down with no good way to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to deadly accurate fire. Maria had been quietly studying the terrain while the men discussed tactics. Her grandfather had taught her to always look for alternative approaches that other people might overlook. While everyone else focused on the direct route to the rustlers' position, she had noticed a dry creek bed that curved around behind their location. The creek bed was not visible from where the rustlers were positioned, and it would provide concealed movement for someone who knew how to use natural terrain to their advantage. Maria had spent countless hours as a child learning to move unseen through difficult country, and she recognized an opportunity when she saw one. Without saying anything to the others, Maria began moving quietly away from their position. She crawled on her hands and knees until she was far enough away that the rustlers could not see her movements, then made her way toward the creek bed that would take her behind their defensive position. Buck noticed her absence just as another volley of shots forced the ranch hands to keep their heads down. "Where is Maria?" he demanded, looking around frantically. Joe Martinez peered over the rocks and saw her distant figure moving through the landscape. "That crazy woman is trying to get herself killed," Joe said. "She's heading right toward those rustlers like she thinks she can take on 3 armed men by herself." Buck felt his heart sink as he realized what Maria was attempting to do. He had seen brave men die trying similar flanking maneuvers, and he could not imagine how a woman with no combat experience could succeed where experienced fighters had failed. The rustlers would spot her approach and kill her before she could get close enough to be effective. But Maria Santos was not thinking like someone with no combat experience. She was remembering every lesson her grandfather had taught her about patient stealth and the proper use of terrain. She reached the creek bed without being detected and began moving carefully along its winding path toward the rustlers' position. The dry creek provided perfect concealment as long as she stayed low and moved quietly. Maria had learned to walk without making sound on any kind of ground, and she used those skills now as she approached the most dangerous moment of her life. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady and her mind was clear and focused. From the creek bed, she could hear the rustlers talking to each other as they continued to pin down Buck and the other ranch hands with periodic gunfire. They were confident and relaxed because they believed they had complete control of the situation. None of them were watching their back trail because they assumed that all their enemies were trapped behind the rocks in front of them. Maria reached a point where she could see the rustlers clearly through a gap in the creek bank. They were about 50 yards away, positioned behind rocks with their attention focused entirely on the ranch hands they had pinned down. It was exactly the kind of shot her grandfather had trained her to make hundreds of times during their practice sessions. She carefully raised her rifle and took aim at the hat of the nearest rustler. Her grandfather had always taught her to give opponents a chance to surrender before resorting to deadly force. A shot that removed a man's hat without harming him would demonstrate superior marksmanship while providing an opportunity for the situation to be resolved without bloodshed. Maria controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger with the smooth, steady pressure that had become second nature through years of practice. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding rocks, and the rustler's hat disappeared from his head as if snatched away by an invisible hand. The man dove for cover, shouting in surprise and confusion. His 2 companions spun around, trying to locate where the shot had come from, but Maria had already worked the bolt action of her rifle and was acquiring her second target. Her next shot kicked up dust directly between the feet of the lead rustler's horse, causing the animal to rear and nearly throw its rider. The rustlers suddenly realized that they were being attacked from an unexpected direction by someone with exceptional shooting skills. The tables had been turned and they were no longer in control of the situation. Maria continued to fire carefully placed shots that demonstrated her ability to kill any of them at will while giving them the opportunity to make the smart choice and surrender. Buck and the other ranch hands heard the shots coming from behind the rustler's position and realized that someone had successfully flanked their enemies. Buck rose from behind the rocks and saw Maria Santos standing on the creek bank with her rifle trained on the confused and frightened rustlers. The 3 thieves looked back and forth between the ranch hands in front of them and the deadly, accurate shooter behind them. They were caught in crossfire by opponents who clearly had superior skills and better tactical position. After a few moments of desperate consideration, they threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Buck Williams stared at Maria Santos with an expression of complete amazement. The woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a cook and housekeeper had just executed a perfect tactical maneuver and demonstrated marksmanship skills that exceeded anything he had seen in 20 years of ranch work. Joe Martinez emerged from behind the rocks with his mouth hanging open in disbelief. The other ranch hands gathered around, talking in excited voices about what they had just witnessed. None of them had ever seen shooting like that from anyone, regardless of gender or experience. Maria walked calmly toward the surrendered rustlers with her rifle held ready, but pointed safely toward the ground. Her face showed the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally been allowed to demonstrate their true capabilities after weeks of being underestimated and ignored. "Where in blazes did you learn to shoot like that, Buck?" demanded when he found his voice again. The woman who had been cooking his meals and cleaning his bunkhouse had just saved their lives and recovered their stolen cattle with skills that seemed almost supernatural. "My grandfather taught me when I was 8 years old," Maria replied simply. "He said a person who cannot protect what matters to them does not deserve to keep it. These cattle matter to you, so they matter to me too." The rustlers were quickly tied up and the stolen cattle were gathered for tea. The ride back to Henderson Ranch passed in a completely different atmosphere than the desperate chase that had begun the morning. The 3 captured rustlers rode with their hands tied behind their backs, while Buck Williams and his men drove the recovered cattle home. But the biggest change was in how everyone looked at Maria Santos, who now rode alongside them as an equal rather than an unwelcome burden they had been forced to accept. Joe Martinez had been completely silent since witnessing Maria's shooting demonstration. The young cowboy who had made countless jokes about having a woman around to take care of them now seemed unable to find any words at all. He kept glancing at Maria with expressions that mixed amazement with something approaching fear. He had never imagined that anyone could shoot with such deadly precision, much less a quiet woman who had been cooking their meals for weeks. Buck Williams rode beside Maria, trying to understand how he had so completely misjudged her abilities. In 20 years as a ranch foreman, he had hired dozens of men and prided himself on being able to evaluate a person's capabilities within minutes of meeting them. But Maria Santos had fooled him completely, and he was still struggling to accept the reality of what he had witnessed. "When we get back to the ranch," Buck said, "finally I want to know everything about your background and training. What you did today was not luck or beginner's fortune. That kind of shooting comes from years of serious practice with someone who knew what they were doing." Maria nodded but did not elaborate on her grandfather's training methods or the countless hours she had spent learning to use weapons in all kinds of conditions. She had finally proven herself where it mattered, and she was content to let her actions speak louder than any words she might offer in explanation. The news of what had happened spread through Willow Creek faster than wildfire in dry grass. By the time the group returned to Henderson Ranch, word had already reached town that the mysterious woman at the ranch had single-handedly captured 3 dangerous rustlers and recovered stolen cattle. People began gathering at the ranch to see for themselves the woman who could supposedly outshoot any man in the county. Old Pete Harrison was waiting at the corral when they rode in, and his weathered face broke into a wide grin when he saw that everyone had returned safely. He had been worried sick about Maria riding into danger, but he had also been confident that she would surprise everyone with her capabilities if given the chance. "Told you she knew more than she was letting on," Pete said to Buck as they unsaddled their horses. "That woman has been waiting weeks for someone to give her a real opportunity to show what she can do." Buck shook his head in amazement. "Pete, you have no idea what we saw out there today. She flanked those rustlers like a military scout and put shots exactly where she wanted them, without breaking a sweat. I have never seen anything like it in my entire life." Within hours of their return, visitors began arriving at Henderson Ranch to meet the woman who had become the talk of every saloon and general store in 3 counties. Ranchers who had been losing cattle to rustlers for months wanted to know if Maria might be willing to help them protect their herds. Town officials asked if she would consider taking a position as a deputy sheriff, since the county clearly needed someone with her skills in law enforcement. But the most significant change came in how the men at Henderson Ranch treated their newest member. Buck Williams called Maria into his office the morning after the rustler incident and offered her a position as a full ranch hand with wages equal to what the most experienced cowboys earned. He also asked if she would be willing to train the other men in advanced shooting techniques, since their skills had proven inadequate for dealing with serious threats. Maria accepted the promotion with quiet satisfaction, but insisted that she would continue to help with cooking duties when her schedule allowed. She had no interest in abandoning work just because it was traditionally considered women's labor. What mattered to her was being judged by her abilities, rather than assumptions about what she could or could not do, based on her gender. The reputation of Maria Santos continued to grow throughout the following months. Rustlers who had been terrorizing ranches across the region seemed to lose interest in operating anywhere near Henderson Ranch or the surrounding area. Word spread through the criminal networks that there was a woman in Willow Creek who could put a bullet through a silver dollar at 100 yards and had no hesitation about using those skills to protect what belonged to honest people. Other ranchers began hiring Maria as a consultant to help them develop better security for their cattle and horses. She would spend a few days at each ranch teaching the cowboys improved shooting techniques and helping them set up defensive positions that would discourage rustler attacks. Her reputation for fairness and effectiveness made her services highly sought after throughout Texas. The men at Henderson Ranch became fiercely protective of their female colleague and genuinely proud to work alongside someone so skilled and respected. Joe Martinez, who had been the most skeptical about Maria's abilities, became one of her most devoted students. He spent hours practicing the shooting techniques she taught him and never again made jokes about women being unable to handle dangerous work. Maria also proved herself equally capable at all the traditional aspects of ranch work. She could rope cattle with the best of them, ride all day in harsh weather, and handle difficult horses that other cowboys found troublesome. Her knowledge of animal behavior and land management gained from years with her grandfather made valuable contributions to the ranch's overall efficiency and profitability. Buck Williams later said that hiring Maria Santos was the best decision he had ever made as foreman. Not only did rustling incidents drop to practically zero, but the ranch's productivity improved dramatically under her influence. She brought fresh ideas about cattle breeding and pasture management that increased their profits while reducing the workload for everyone involved. As word of her abilities spread beyond Texas, Maria began receiving offers from ranches as far away as Colorado and Wyoming. Wealthy cattle barons wanted to hire her as a security specialist, while law enforcement agencies offered her positions that would have made her one of the highest paid peace officers in the American West. But Maria chose to remain at Henderson Ranch, where she felt appreciated and respected for who she really was rather than being treated as a curiosity or novelty. She eventually saved enough money to purchase her own small ranch, where she employed both men and women as equals and judged them solely on their abilities and character rather than their gender or background. Years later, when newspaper reporters came to interview the famous sharpshooter of Willow Creek, Maria would always redirect their questions away from her shooting abilities and toward the importance of giving people opportunities to prove themselves, regardless of initial appearances. She insisted that her success came not from being exceptional, but from being given the chance to demonstrate skills that many people possessed but were never allowed to show. The old-timers in Willow Creek still tell stories about the day a quiet young woman changed their entire understanding of what courage and competence looked like. They remember how she proved that respect must be earned through demonstrated ability rather than granted based on assumptions about gender or social position. Maria Santos became a legend not because she was a woman who could shoot, but because she was a person who refused to accept limitations that others tried to place on her dreams and ambitions. She showed an entire community that the most dangerous mistake anyone can make is underestimating someone based on appearances rather than taking the time to discover what they are truly capable of accomplishing when given a fair chance to prove themselves. Her story became an inspiration for generations of young people who were told they could not achieve their goals because of who they were rather than what they could do. Maria Santos proved that determination combined with genuine skill will always triumph over prejudice and small-minded thinking when given the opportunity to demonstrate itself in ways that cannot be ignored or dismissed. 5 years had passed since Maria Santos first stepped off that dusty bus in Willow Creek, Texas, and her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The woman who had once been dismissed as unsuitable for ranch work now owned the most successful cattle operation in 3 counties. Her ranch employed 15 people, including both men and women, who worked side by side as equals in an arrangement that was revolutionary for the 1950s. Maria stood on the porch of her ranch house watching the morning activities as her employees began their daily work. The sun was just rising over the Texas horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that reminded her of the morning she had spent with her grandfather, learning the lessons that had shaped her entire life. She still missed the old man, who had taught her that a person's worth should be measured by their character and abilities, rather than their gender or social position. The Santos Ranch, as it had come to be known, was different from other cattle operations in the region. Maria had implemented innovative breeding programs that produced healthier cattle with better meat quality. She had also developed new grazing techniques that kept the land productive even during drought years when other ranches struggled to feed their herds. Her success had attracted attention from agricultural colleges and government agencies who wanted to study her methods. But what made Maria most proud was the way her ranch served as a training ground for young people who were told they could not achieve their dreams because of who they were or where they came from. She had taken in runaway girls who had been told that marriage was their only option and taught them to be skilled ranch hands. She had hired men who had been rejected by other employers because of their race or background and given them opportunities to prove their worth. On this particular morning, Maria was expecting a special visitor. A telegram had arrived 3 days earlier from a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, who claimed to be facing the same kind of discrimination that Maria had overcome years before. Sarah was the daughter of a wealthy ranch owner in Colorado, but her father refused to let her participate in the family business because he believed that cattle ranching was no work for a lady. Sarah had heard stories about Maria Santos and had traveled over 500 miles to meet the woman who had proven that gender should not determine a person's career opportunities. She wanted to learn from Maria and possibly find work at a ranch where her abilities would be valued more than social expectations about proper behavior for women. Maria remembered her own desperate journey to Texas and the frustration of being judged by her appearance rather than her capabilities. She had immediately responded to Sarah's telegram with an invitation to visit the ranch and discuss opportunities for training and employment. If this young woman had even half the determination that Maria had possessed, she would be a valuable addition to the ranch family. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of the stagecoach that ran twice weekly between Willow Creek and the larger towns to the north. Maria walked down to the main road to meet her guest and saw a young woman with blonde hair and determined blue eyes step down from the coach. Sarah Mitchell was about 20 years old with the kind of refined appearance that suggested wealth and education, but also something harder in her expression that spoke of someone who had fought battles that polite society never acknowledged. "Miss Santos," Sarah said, extending her hand in greeting. "I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you agreed to meet with me. Your story has given me hope that there might be a place in this world for women who want to do more than just marry well and raise children." Maria shook the young woman's hand and immediately recognized the firm grip and direct gaze of someone who was serious about learning and working. "Call me Maria," she said with a smile. "And you are welcome here for as long as you want to stay. But I should warn you that ranch work is not romantic or easy. If you truly want to learn this business, you will have to be prepared for long days of hard physical labor in all kinds of weather conditions." Sarah's eyes lit up with excitement rather than fear at the prospect of difficult work. "That is exactly what I want," she said. "My father thinks I should be content to sit in parlors and discuss fashion with other wealthy women while men make all the important decisions about business and money. But I know I am capable of much more than that if someone will just give me the opportunity to prove it." Over the following weeks, Maria began teaching Sarah the same lessons her grandfather had taught her decades earlier. They started with basic horsemanship and cattle handling before moving on to more advanced skills like reading weather patterns and understanding animal behavior. Sarah proved to be an eager student who absorbed information quickly and was never afraid to ask questions when she did not understand something. The other employees at Santos Ranch welcomed Sarah warmly and helped with her training. Joe Martinez, who had once been Maria's biggest skeptic, now served as her most trusted foreman, and he took special pleasure in teaching new people the advanced techniques he had learned from Maria. Pete Harrison had retired from active ranch work, but still lived on the property and served as an advisor and storyteller who helped newcomers understand the history and culture of ranch life. Sarah's shooting lessons began after she had mastered the basic skills of ranch work. Maria had learned from experience that marksmanship was not just about protecting cattle from rustlers, but also about earning the respect of people who believed that women were naturally inferior at activities requiring strength and precision. She taught Sarah to shoot with the same patient methods her grandfather had used, starting with close targets and gradually increasing the distance and difficulty. Within 3 months, Sarah could hit tin cans from 50 yards away and was beginning to develop the kind of confidence that came from knowing she could protect herself and others if dangerous situations arose. More importantly, she had gained the respect of everyone on the ranch through her willingness to work hard and learn from her mistakes without complaining or expecting special treatment. Word of Sarah's progress reached her father in Colorado through letters she wrote to her mother. Charles Mitchell was a proud man who had built his cattle empire through decades of hard work and shrewd business decisions. He had always assumed that his daughter would eventually marry a suitable man who could take over the family business. But Sarah's letters describing her new life challenged all of his assumptions about what women were capable of accomplishing. When Sarah had been at Santos Ranch for 6 months, her father arrived unexpectedly to see for himself what his daughter had been doing in Texas. Charles Mitchell stepped down from his private railroad car, expecting to find a spoiled young woman, playing at ranch work under the indulgent supervision of other women, who did not understand the serious nature of cattle business. Instead, he found his daughter expertly handling a difficult horse, while directing a crew of experienced cowboys and moving cattle to new grazing areas. Sarah had developed the kind of quiet authority that came from demonstrated competence, and the men working under her supervision clearly respected her judgment and leadership abilities. Maria watched from a distance as father and daughter had their first conversation in over a year. She could see the surprise and confusion in Charles Mitchell's face as he realized that his daughter had developed real skills and genuine expertise during her time away from home. Sarah's transformation from sheltered wealthy girl to capable ranch professional had been as dramatic as Maria's own journey from dismissed kitchen help to respected cattle expert. That evening, Charles Mitchell asked to speak privately with Maria about his daughter's future. He was a man who had spent his entire life believing that certain roles in society were natural and unchangeable. But Sarah's obvious competence had forced him to reconsider assumptions he had never questioned before. "Miss Santos," he said, "I came here expecting to take my daughter home and put an end to what I thought was a foolish adventure. But I can see that Sarah has learned things here that I never imagined a woman could master. I am beginning to understand that I may have been wrong about what she is capable of achieving." Maria smiled at the older man's admission. "Your daughter has worked harder than most men I have known," she said. "She has earned the right to make her own decisions about her future based on her abilities, rather than other people's expectations about what women should or should not do with their lives." Charles Mitchell nodded slowly. "I would like to offer her a position managing part of our Colorado operation," he said. "It would mean admitting publicly that I was wrong about women's capabilities, but I think that is a lesson I need to learn. Would you be willing to recommend her for such responsibility?" Maria looked toward the bunkhouse where Sarah was cleaning her rifle after the day's work. The young woman had found the same kind of purpose and satisfaction that Maria had discovered when she finally got the chance to prove herself. "I think Sarah is ready for whatever challenges you want to give her," she said. "But you should ask her what she wants to do rather than assuming you know what is best for her future."